Welcome to today's webinar, Keys to Success, Resident-Led Community Change Approaches. My name is Heather Keem, and I'm the Manager of Cities Deepening Community with Vibrant Communities at Tamarack. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Jessie Sutherland. Jessie is an international speaker and trainer, Director of the Intercultural Strategies, and founder and innovator of the award-winning Finding Home, Neighborhood Dialogue, and Capacity Building Program. I watched Jessie's TEDx talk on how to belong in a rapid changing world, and I asked Jessie to come onto a call and share her wisdom with our members. So welcome, Jessie, and over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Heather, and it's fantastic to be here. I'm so excited to be connected to everyone on the call. And so time is of the essence, and I'll dive right in. Okay, there we go. To start with, I think it's really important that everyone knows that I am here today because I stand for true, at this particular juncture in human history, for true belonging. And what I mean by this is that when we look at the heart of any given social problem, we'll always find a group of people that feel pushed out. So on the one hand, this means supporting people that have felt pushed out, who are marginalized, to build their voice, their capacity, and their agency so that they can contribute to and be part of the picnic table of life, so to speak. And on the other hand, it means teaching the rest of the community how to listen and how to act on what we hear so that together we can address our most pressing social problems. I really believe through all the years of work on various social problems in lots of different contexts that the secret sauce of building cultures of belonging can unleash dormant strengths and talents so that we can truly work together to tackle some of the most pressing social problems and watch the magic happens when we do that. And I've come to this understanding through personal experience, through research, and through working in the field. So a few hours after I was born, I was placed into foster care, and my early experience of foster care and later adoption has really given me a sensitivity to and an attunement to a sense of belonging. So when I started working in the nonprofit field and working on social issues since I was 20, I have focused my work on working with the people most impacted by any given social problem. And this particular sensitivity to belonging helped me discover what I'm hoping to do a deeper dive in today with you. And so a body of work throughout my career has been using the belonging lens to address social problems. And then I took a 5-year hiatus where I did some research and looked at large-scale social change movements around the world and came up with a new framework that I published in a book. And then that led to the birth of the Finding Home, How to Belong in a Changing World initiative, which is a residents-led community change approach. So today, that's just a little bit about where I'm coming from. And just so you know, Heather, there's nowhere for me to click the slides. So I guess, oh, here they are. So I know that everyone on the call today already knows about building trust and strength-based approaches to community change. So today what I want to be doing is really focusing on keys to success in residents-led community change approaches, which will include some sustainability tools as well as planning for pitfalls. And so how I'd like to do that is what we've just done: welcome and introduction, a little bit of background on residents-led approaches, give you a case study, then dive into the sustainability tools, pitfalls, and open it up for discussion and next steps. So I'm going to fly through the next 2 slides super quickly. As we all know, residents-led community change approaches come from community development. So I took this definition from the United Nations. Community development is a process where community members come together to take collective action and generate solutions to common problems. And as everyone on the call knows about strength-based approaches, the residents-led approach does come out of strength-based, asset-based community development. So looking on the right side, where we're really focused on people and relationships and seeing a community as glass half full rather than half empty. So as I've worked on residents-led community change, I've come up with this framework for thinking about it, about the actual roadmap. So the first piece is whatever the given social problem is, to first identify the missing voices or the voices that absolutely need to be involved. So that means the people most impacted by the social problem, as well as the people that have influence over decision making, so that we can make a connection there. Once we identify those voices, if they're not already involved, then there's the whole process of how to engage them and build those relationships. Once people are engaged, then the hard work of building that sense of belonging is a big chunk of the process. And once we have that sense of belonging, then of course, we need to foster collaboration across all of that diversity. And then from that place of belonging and collaboration, we're able to work together to create change. So that's a bit of the roadmap that I like to see, think about residents-led community change approaches. And so in terms of the case study, I mentioned the Finding Home initiative. The key program within that initiative is called Belonging Matters. It's a residents-led community change approach that fosters a sense of belonging, increases intercultural collaboration, and generates innovative self-organizing projects to address a community's priority issue. So we've been doing this work. It was launched in 2006 and have worked in 8 different languages on every possible social issue you can imagine, from sexual violence to racism to achieving the TRC goals to poverty, housing, you name it, and any demographic you can think of, from youth and elders and families and people with disabilities, Indigenous people, refugees, you name it, LGBTQ. We've been working in all those different communities. So today I wanted to share some of the pieces that I hope can help you in your work. I want to make this worth your time. So from working on all these issues with this diversity of demographics, this is how I've started to think about how to build cultures of belonging. First, if you see the bubble at the top, we start with the people most impacted. And when we're working with people most impacted, our process is a series of 4 sessions, 2-hour sessions, to do this deeper work. But in summary, what we're listening for, the key pieces are the relationships and values that need strengthening. So whenever anyone has felt pushed out due to a social problem, there is always relationships and values that have been eroded. So we're listening for and looking for how to strengthen those relationships and values. And then we're looking at how can we restore a sense of dignity. When people feel pushed out, there's often a lot of shame, and also people's competencies and strengths are being ignored most of the time. So we're looking at restoring dignity, voice, and agency. And as this happens, then there's an opportunity for the rest of the community to learn new ways to listen to people most impacted and act on what we hear through shifting our attitudes, behaviors, systems, and policies. And so there's a process as people with lived experience build their sense of belonging from the inside out, working with the other stakeholders to listen and act on what we hear and turn the core values that have been identified into actions to shift our attitudes, behaviors, systems, and policies. And then from that place, we can actually create change together. So it's like I said at the beginning, looking at building cultures of belonging as a two-way relationships. On the one hand, there's the people most impacted. Again, the focus is restoring dignity. Often people have experienced a lack of trust in the systems and people around them that help make the pushing out possible. So experience trust, developing your unique voice again, draw on your strengths, experience agency, and move into action. Everyone else learns to listen, act on what we hear, create the space so that people feel valued and part of decision making, and leverage our strengths and resources to support the leadership of those most impacted. And of course, that's going to take practicing new skills. So some sample projects to bring this a little bit to life. I'll briefly touch on one aspect, the values and relationships piece in these three projects. So there was a project several years ago on elder financial abuse in the family in ethnocultural communities. And we worked with, the picture on the left is a group of Afghan elders. And as we explored elder financial abuse, which they shared stories and identified respect in the family was the core value that had been eroded to create the different types of experiences of being taken advantage of. And what that led to is drawing on their strengths. It was a group that was, many were illiterate in their first, second, third, fourth language, and many were also seamstresses. So they drew on their strengths as seamstresses and storytellers and created shadow puppet theater show on building respect, fostering respect in the family. There was a South Asian Punjabi group who identified gender equality and raising their sons to be, needing to raise their sons to be kind and caring as core values to grow to address elder financial abuse in their communities. They created a skit, and they also ended up knocking door to door in their neighborhood and offering workshops to the local banks on how to protect their money, and created these presentations. The third group was half Iranian, half multicultural, and they identified awareness and empowerment as key values to grow to address financial abuse in their communities, and started a Victims to Champions Speakers Bureau, which became so popular that the community policing asked to partner with them, and they just went viral, their speaking engagements. And so we found a graduate student who was doing community video making because they wanted to turn it into a video so they didn't have to go to all the speaking engagements. And they created a video that then has gone national since that time. So that one group, that one project, which worked only with 3 groups of 12 elders in each group, ended up impacting 2.5 million people in a year and a half through direct presentations, them going out, and they were, before starting the project, they were not engaged or connected with any services. So it was reaching people that were the most isolated and marginalized in their communities. So that's one example of how we connect the values and relationship piece. The next one I'll just briefly touch on is the one on poverty. We worked with young families, families with young children who were living in poverty. And as they shared stories, one of the pieces that they identified as they moved from one economic situation into poverty was shame. And they shared stories about telling their children not to tell their neighbors they're going to the food bank, about no longer joining friends at barbecues because they didn't feel like they could contribute what they used to contribute. So that shame leading to more isolation. So from that place of wanting to strengthen the value of dignity to address the shame, they created peer conversation cafes or conversations with other peers to connect them to resources and to also build connections so that people would have the tools to move out of poverty, as well as work with obviously more system change is needed for that as well. And the third one is a recent project, which was Oliver Parks and Recreation in British Columbia wanted to meet their truth and reconciliation goals and create more welcoming and inclusive spaces for recreation and sports in their center. And Soyuz Indian Band is right across the main road from Oliver Parks and Rec. And so we did a Belonging Matters process with youth, adults, and children in a Soyuz Indian Band. And we were listening for core stories that could shift the minds and hearts and lead to attitude, behavior, policy system change. And so I'll just share one of the stories. There was many, many stories. So one of the girls, young women, shared a story when she was in elementary school. When the Okanagan song was sung, all her classmates would sit down, roll their eyes, not participate. She was so devastated and hurt that a song that she cherished so much was so disrespected that ever after that, she sat down whenever O Canada was sung. And recently, with the curriculum change in First Nations education, there was a class that learned Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth learned how to sing the Okanagan song together, and they stood and sang it. And when she heard that for the first time, she just wept. And this shifted many things for her. So when it came time, and some of the other stories were around the problems were, you know, in non-Indigenous parents not sitting next to Indigenous parents in the stands, not allowing their children to go on sleepovers within the Soyuz Indian Band Reservation. There was, you know, all sorts of different issues that were coming up, issues in the pool between lifeguards and Soyuz Indian Band youth. So in the piece where we then build that sense of belonging from the inside out, and then do a reflection piece with this frontline workers, lots of different solutions came from the community on how to address this, and then those changes have started to happen immediately. So for example, during the summer, this happened in the spring, during the summer, all the different festivals that went on, they integrated everybody learning the Okanagan song. Lifeguards reflected on this story and made changes in how they interacted with the Soyuz Indian Band youth. Small changes like shifting the celebration was usually at the end of a sports year. They shifted it to relationship building at the beginning of the year and orientation, matching newcomer parents to hockey, could be refugee family with a Soyuz Indian Band families, so that they knew how to use hockey gear. There was lots and lots of immediate shifts that happened. So I wanted to include that third one to show how this works from building belonging and the empowerment of the residents, but also how we can integrate it into our systems and attitudes and beliefs. So we are very fortunate. The province of BC did a year-long research. They wanted us to do a research around sustainability tools for residents-led community change processes like this, with a focus on the senior sector growing out of the elder abuse project. So we were lucky and we were able to go back to each site 5 years later. And 100% of any elder that was involved, unless they had passed away or were experiencing a serious health issue like dementia, showed up 5 years later for a focus group. And we are also able to do focus groups with the agency leaders, as well as we convened a sustainability focus group, an Indigenous focus group, and a policy focus group, so we could link all these things together and hopefully support lots of people doing this work. So the first thing we learned is what benefits come from these kind of, in particular, the finding home process, but I'm sure from many other residents-led approaches, the participants talked about personal transformation, more of a sense of belonging, being connected to community resources, having large peer support, and also the leadership that came out of the self-organizing projects to make real meaningful contributions and change to their community. The organizations that hosted them said that they had immediate feedback and were able to improve their programs and services. They were able to develop a stronger leadership base, and there was more intercultural and social cohesion within their programs. The communities that were getting the speaking or presentations from the participants increased their cultural competency, strengthened intercultural relationships, because each project starts listening for opportunities and lots of intercultural exchanges start happening from neighborhood to neighborhood. And our government partners talked about how they were able to identify emerging trends for making better decisions when the data collection tools are integrated into the process. So I want to give you a few of the highlights of the keys to success that we learned from having those focus groups in hopes it'll help you. The 5 key things are understanding the resources needed to really do this work well. The importance of having an anchor organization. It can't really kind of float out there. Residents need to be connected to an organization that's going to develop strong relationships with them in an ongoing way. The internal team within an organization, a community partnership model. There's no one organization can make this kind of community change. And also thinking through how does this work in a community-wide approach. So those were the 5 keys to success that were identified. When we looked at the resources, and this was focused, we had to focus on one project to come up. So each project is going to be different. The resources that we were able to tease out that a host organization would need to host a Belonging Matters type of year-long process. When we calculated all the staff time, all the volunteer time, the food, the space, the printing, and in many cases interpretation and translation, as well as the recognition pieces, it was about $12,500. It doesn't mean that you need $12,500. It means you need at least in-kind support that's going to be equivalent to that. And the second piece is really key, is having a readiness assessment before you actually dive into a residents-led community change approach, because you can raise expectations if there's no follow-through to action with residents that are just starting to build belonging. And then if it doesn't get supported, there can be fallout from that. So the ingredients for an anchor organization that's considering a residents-led approach was the resources we just talked about, already having an active program with at least 1 dedicated program staff. Volunteer and transportation program is pretty helpful. An internal champion and a community champion. So what I mean by that, someone within the organization that's going to champion this in a decision-making role. And a community champion means somebody connected to the organization that's bicultural, bilingual, that has high trust and large networks in their own communities, and strong community partnerships, and has strength-based values and ethos. The sustainability tool number 2, this is a sample internal team that was teased out in having the focus groups with the host agencies that realized it is a lot of work with emerging needs that come to really leverage and support the strengths that are emerging from the people that they're supporting. So what we worked out was that you'd see in the middle is the agency leader, and ideally you're looking at a practicum student, so that is doing a year-long or 10-month or 8-month practicum with you that can do a big chunk of the coordination logistics data collection. A cultural champion that's doing the networking, interpretation, and translation, and then any additional volunteer support that's needed. We have an actual, for this particular program, we now have a cost protection tool and a handbook that looks at all the skills and talents that would be needed, and you can fill those gaps either with staff or with volunteers. And the other piece was in doing this process in a lot of different communities, there was one community that stood out in terms of sustainability, and they had established from the get-go a community partnership model. It was the health authority that took care of space, convening, and supporting the elders in this case to take action, and Parks and Rec, which also did convenings and supporting the elders to take action. But then they were partnered with a community foundation who not only found the funds to bring us in, but also was able to leverage funds whenever there was an emerging need. So in this case, it was in Victoria, and the elders wanted to start conversation cafes to address isolation. And they were able to leverage relationships, so TV spots or radio spots to get the word out, connections to Tim Hortons, as well as funding partners that would take care of printing costs. So it wasn't a huge amount of resources, but when the momentum is high and there isn't support right away to implement, momentum can die down. So to have a partner that's there to address emerging needs as they happen can be super helpful instead of waiting a year to get a small neighborhood grant for $500 or whatever it is. And the next piece is turning this into a community change model so that we're looking at the residents' sense of belonging as well as the community change piece. So we've put it into 9 phases: the readiness assessment, the getting started, building your team, et cetera, preparing for the residents' dialogues. There's a fair bit to do around logistics, getting culturally relevant resource kits that are strength-based, and a bunch of art of inviting work so that you can reach the most residents possible that need it the most, or possibly the least connected. And then the residents' dialogues are actually only a month, 2 hours a week that go through this process. And then there's support for number 5 is residents taking action. So sometimes there's more skills during the 4 weeks that are needed to support the next step. So for example, with the elders puppet show, we had a puppet theater artist for the next couple of months support them in creating their puppet show. There's the data collection, and then through working with the residents, a process for training the people that most need to know this information. So at the beginning of each project, you already identify an elder abuse. It might be banks, it might be, it could be service providers. There's all sorts of people that might need to know that information that could make a huge impact. So having those opportunities for training and reflection with the elders themselves and the frontline workers. And then, of course, a big celebrating success event where we're showcasing visual legacies of what's happened, as well as the seed projects that the residents have launched and are supported with in the final report and dissemination. So that's the community change model. And so I'm going to touch briefly, very briefly, so we have enough time for discussion, on pitfalls in resident-led community change processes. The number 1 pitfall is who makes the decision. There's a tension between often agencies and lead agency making all the decisions, residents making all the decisions, or the funder, everyone making it funder driven, even if things on the ground are saying something else is needed. So this is a tricky piece, and that would be a whole webinar upon themselves. But I'll just say how we're dealing with it we're working with Richmond's overdose crisis, which is 32 stakeholders and working with substance users as well on this process. And I'm not sure why it's not clicking. Heather, did you want to try? Oh, there we go. So in this process, as the project consultant, I'm preparing the next step. I'm accountable to the hiring committee, but it's really a 32 stakeholder initiative. I've created a brain trust so that there's not one, they didn't want any one agency to be steering it. So we've created a brain trust of who has expertise that in between our larger community action team meetings, or provide a bit of a brain trust to give feedback and expertise. And then the actual working group meeting, I'm designing and facilitating decision-making processes with the next step. And that's where they contribute their expertise and networks. And then depending on the decisions there, the project team, we turn that into deliverables for the next step around building this culture of belonging and addressing stigma. The second one is people can get gung-ho about a community-led process, but not do enough planning to think about the saboteurs that are in any particular group. Again, this could be a whole webinar, so I won't get into the solutions here. I do have some handouts on it. Some of the saboteurs that we can come across are the tyranny of the loudest. So even if the minority voice might take up 90% of the space, the long-winded, the rule-obsessed, the nitpicker, the subject changer, we all know the organized hijacker. So to plan for these, and there's ways to do that. And the third one is missing a key ingredient, really understanding what it takes to build a culture of belonging. So all the ingredients might be there, but if we're not attuned to and supporting the restoring of dignity, trust, voice, and agency in the residents themselves that are most impacted, we won't get to where we need to go. And there can be a tendency to go from raising awareness and into action too quickly. And in some cases, we need a lot more scaffolding between awareness and agency and action. So there might be, as awareness is raised, there might be more scaffolding around supporting agencies. So in this case, there's a picture of some Iranian elders who had experienced so much agency taken away from them in Iran that it was hard to trust that they could actually have agency in Canada. So it was starting with small things, like they really wanted to see a river. So having a celebrating success event that they organized at a river was a huge scaffolding piece. And later you might integrate larger pieces of action. So that's a piece. And so in some, I'm trying to back here, the journey to belonging and finding home. We use the metaphor of home a lot in our work and have discovered that this common yearning in our rapidly changing world, our common yearning for home is a potentially unifying force that can reconnect us to our values and to key relationships. So when we use a boat metaphor, home is on the horizon. Our values are the rudder that guides our attitudes and actions. And really the relationships are the people power that get us there. And so the essential questions for the journey, why are we doing this? Where are we headed? What's our rudder, so our values? Who is in our boat? Do we have the right people to get us there in the first place? And how are we going to work together? So that's the main chunk of what I wanted to share with you today. In terms of, yeah, go ahead, Heather.
Oh, do you have any
Oh,
more slides?
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of ways to continue engagement, I could maybe speak at the end, the next slides at the very end.
Okay. I'd like to take this opportunity to have people submit their questions, and or we would love for you to raise your hand and you can ask your own question instead of me reading it out. So I actually have a lot of questions, but I'm going to read Sabrina's first. And in your slide about the community partnership model, she wants to know, where do the residents fit in?
Sorry, in the which slide?
The community partnership model that you put in there, but the community, you talked about, I think, public health and recreation. Where did community fit in there, or residents?
Right. So this is the piece, so the internal, so it's connected to the internal team part. So in each organization, there should be some kind of connection between, and that's the cultural champion. Okay. But to have the right partnerships there so that there's financial and resource sustainability is a key ingredient. Does that help?
Yes, it does. So please put your hand up to ask your question. I do have a question about evaluation. So I'm all about, was anyone better off by the work we did? And in my learning from Tamarack and across Canada and community engagement work, we do the work, but we don't quite know how to evaluate. So in your learnings, can you provide some ideas or suggestions about evaluating resident-led work?
Yeah, I think it's pretty key to get really clear on what we are trying to achieve and finding ways to track that. A big piece of that is needing to change funding structures so there can be more long-term developmental evaluation. So right now with the overdose crisis, we are building for that particular project some evaluation tools at the beginning that we can then track. So each project is different what you want to change. Is it isolation? Is it stigma? Is it a sense of belonging? And creating the right measures at the beginning and in the end. I did take Tamarack's with Michael Quinn principle-based evaluation, which I think is actually the closest matchup for this kind of work, because we know it's the long-term relationships that make the biggest impact. And where I could see, and this is what we really want to test, but we haven't tested yet, is in the process where residents end up identifying, sharing stories, and then together we kind of dig for the values and the relationships. I could see turning those values into guiding principles that then are used as an ongoing evaluation process.
That's a great idea. We actually just had a webinar with Michael Quinn-Patton, and it was like the top webinar, but he had some great points, and I actually might include that recording in the post link because I really do think, and I hear, we're not evaluating enough. More to say that we're making a difference. Not
Yes.
how many pamphlets we sent out, but that we are truly making a difference. So thanks for that. We have another question. If you have any tips, this is from Nicole. She was wondering if you have any tips for assessing the sense of belonging in a community.
Oh, the $1 million question. Again, each community is different. So what's key is to really narrow down in whatever community you're working in, what is the presenting problem and where do you want to end up in? So every community sense of belonging, isolation, or marginalization, however you want to label it, is going to be different. And so being really clear on where you are now and what movement do you want to see. So when we look at Richmond, there's high stigma around anyone using drugs, and there's different presenting problems around that. So where do we want to go? These are the things that are happening. Every time there's a modular housing, there's huge pushback. So what shift do we want to see? And then working on assessment tools from there. So the key piece, I think, for a lot of people working on social change is narrowing down what is the presenting problem and what would make you feel like you reached success, and from that place develop the assessment tools.
Great. So the next two questions are really long. I'm going to try to summarize. So Laura asked, how would you address the challenges of engaging community partners that have long past become studied or tokenized community partners as a result of many past poor experiences?
And are those poor experiences real and continuing, or based on real experience?
It's probably, I'm going to kind of speak on her behalf, but it's probably when we go out and we survey them to death and never respond back, they don't see the changes. So how do you engage those partners?
Okay, so if it's based on our lack of follow through, the first thing is to follow through and show that you're trusting that you will follow through. So if people have been over engaged and they're no longer wanting to contribute, often it's up to us to show that we've changed and we are truly going to listen and truly draw on their strengths and their interests. So if I have to do a redo, I've worked in a few communities where it's helping an organization do a redo, in a way, a do-over, I guess is the term. And that takes a lot of work. It's one-on-one meetings in person and building trust from there and showing immediately, being very careful with the parameters, because people always want the moon, being very careful with parameters, and to follow up on what we say we're going to do, and also support their interests. So sometimes I've been working on a project where what they want doesn't fit within the scope. It doesn't work for this particular project, but as I come across resources or information or other partners that I think will help their goal, I make them the connection. So shifting from utilitarian way of using each other to do our time-limited project objectives for funding to more of a relationship focus. So that's if it's that. If it's the other, that there's been an organization that's tokenized because they're whatever reason, but they are genuine and do have things of value to contribute, it's starting to show that we see their contribution and finding ways to showcase it. It's like in any relationship.
Mm-hmm. I really like how you said about your parameters. So, being very clear what's in scope and what's out of scope. So, if you're as an organization, being clear on your mandate, and that, if it's out of your mandate, saying you will link that up with those who can do it, but, not trying to shoot for the moon.
Yes,
And I do like in your model about the celebration piece. So if you bring back everybody that you consulted and is working on it and you celebrate it, you're celebrating them and their
absolutely.
contribution.
And a key piece that we always do is we have a template where we track every single contribution. And that from the beginning, we're thinking of ways to showcase organizational logos on different aspects. So, from volunteers to organization to staff, that at the Celebrating Success, we're showcasing the residents, obviously their seed projects, the visual legacies that were created. We have learning posters, all sorts of things that celebrate their achievements, but also all the volunteers and all the partners that have contributed, and really noticing that and having an opportunity to recognize that is absolutely key. There can be a tendency with the funding climate to just go in a utilitarian way, project to project. Who do I need to achieve X, Y, or Z?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the next question is, this comes from Sabrina. If residents are trying to do projects or initiatives in their community and they are relying predominantly on their own resources, government agencies and fundings may not be involved, those as in brackets, are there models available to them? So if they're trying to do it themselves and not have external agencies involved.
I am sure there are amazing models. I'm trying to remember one that was somebody told me about, but I haven't followed up on. I think it's called the Japanese model, where it's a neighborhood by neighborhood model around health education. I do think there might be an agency involved though. So I can't speak to that.
Okay. Can you just talk a little bit more about the brain trust piece? Because we kind of skimmed over it. And explain
So
a little bit about that process.
yeah, so when I started the project, there was a mini sort of committee before every major community action team, but that committee wasn't necessarily that they would decide what was going to be the agenda for the community action team. But it didn't necessarily, you can't always include everything in every step. So I just suggested we try out a brain trust. And what I mean by a brain trust, at one of the meetings, we had a questionnaire, and within it was what the members' personal strengths and talents are, as well as their organizational strengths and talents, and then whether they wanted to join the brain trust, which is a meeting in between the larger community action team meetings, where I've pulled together whatever information is needed and decision-making processes to move to the next step in the process. And then people signed up for those brain trusts. And they're available to the project on an as-needed basis. And so if during the project, so for example, the local social planner is on the brain trust, I needed a map of the city for the next process. I was able to email her, she brings the map. I wanted to talk through one of the next steps to get her input because she has that social planning expertise. I could draw on anyone who signed up as needed, or anyone in the community action team. And then for the governance planning and decision making, each step will require different expertise. So I pulled together things, they give feedback and input, as well as could take on different pieces. So I have a list of people that have agreed to be called on as needed.
I like that because again, in the stories that I hear across Canada, the one thing that's really coming up is their leadership team. And there's people that hijack it, that take it over. The dynamics of it's being too political and not too, residents are not wanting to join. And I get a lot of inquiries about how do we fix this?
Yeah, so that we are thinking about that in this project. For example, there is one person on the Brain Trust who is, there's many people on the Brain Trust who are peers, who are substance users. There are some people that are peers, and there are some people that are, that's their expertise and job is peer engagement within some of the agencies. And so we have one person that whose sole responsibility is to look through absolutely everything before any community action team to make the languaging accessible, and if needed to actually sit down with the peers and go through everything to get their input first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to, learn a little bit more about, and I love the slide about the personalities, the different ways that it can derail. And I think that we don't spend enough time on the building of the leadership team. We jump right to the community and the work. And you
Yeah.
need a good solid foundation before you can then build.
And that's a key piece that is also another whole webinar is
Yeah.
the how to build unity and polarization. There can be a tendency to want to convene our own choir that believes the same as us. But if we do that, we will get pushback from the group that doesn't agree with us. And so there's a way to design governance meetings that has that spectrum of polarization and to build unity in polarization. Because if we don't understand and talk to our opposite, we can't see the whole, and we're not actually going to move forward in the long run. We might do a ton of work for a year and then get pushed back by our opposite.
Right. There is a question here, and I'm not quite sure I fully understand. It's from Alan. How do we consider gray zone for the category of people who you consider as most impacted? So I want to make sure that I asked your question, Alan, but can you send maybe a more of a clarification of what you're asking?
The great zone of who is impacted, like how to identify who is impacted, because any social problem, lots of people are impacted.
As in, what if there isn't just one group of people you most impact?
I don't think there ever is. So I think I would need a specific example. So let me just choose one. So if it's elder abuse and ethnocultural communities, obviously elders are the most impacted because they're the ones being taken advantage of. But then there's also an impact by other members of the family, or there can be a wider impact. So I'm not sure if that's the question or.
Mm-hmm. It's like the ripple effect, right? Like the pebble hits where you want to go, but there's ripple effects that will affect the different populations.
Yeah, so for example, we worked first with the elders themselves, and through that process, created opportunities for them to be in dialogue and contact with adult children and larger family members, so that the people that are most impacted are the ones that are actually being taken advantage of. And then, of course, there's a ripple effect with friends and family in the larger community, as well as banks and all sorts of different pieces.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like mapping out, right? You have your main target, but there's also sub-targets that will be affected by it. And, going back to evaluation, you can monitor those sub-targets too and see how affected they are.
And it's also, that's why the community change was a process wheel, that it's a constant circle, because it's like an onion, you keep on finding another layer. So you might start with elders and go through that cycle, and through that find the next key group to work with, or maybe there's multiple groups. So with the Richmond example, when we're talking about peers, we're in the process of deciding, but likely there'll be two peer groups: substance users themselves as one group, and another group, their friends and families.
Okay. I'm just looking at the time. So if we want to continue with the slides.
Sure. So I just have a couple of slides around different ways that I'd be happy to support folks. So we do a ton of speaking and training and mentorship packages, and that can be from interagency, getting people on board with this belonging lens, culture of belonging, how to address whatever social issue through keynotes and small group processes, lots of different training opportunities and individual mentorship. Some of the other resources is the book, newsletter, and also next year will be another round of a community of practice people can join. Oh, that's how we did it that time. Oops.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So, and then, of course, if there's an interest for a deeper dive, I often, after webinars or talks, will offer an hour with organizations that want to do a deeper dive on a Zoom call, and you'd be welcome to know about that.
I just want to thank you, Jessie. I'm very inspired, and here at Tamarack, we like to, it's almost like a buffet. We like to show you the menu of options, what resources, what's out there to help you do your community change work. How do you deepen the sense of community? And this webinar and the work that Jessie's doing is one example of the ways that you can do that and the resources that are out there. Some Tamarack resources that we have for you is our Deepening Community Journal that comes out bi-monthly. And this is where we share the stories. What is out there across Canada and beyond? What new tools are out there? If you want to share your work, we would love for you to write a blog and share the amazing work that you're doing. We also have just recently launched an asset-based community development community of practice, and we touched upon that in this webinar to dive deeper into the John McKnight's principles. And we also have a website that you can go to at tamarackcommunity.ca that has a lot more tools and resources. And we will be emailing you after this with the recording and the slides. And what we'll do is I will put a request in there if anybody wants to do another session where you dive deep with Jessie and has some questions. And if you're interested in that, I don't mind facilitating it and kind of doing a post follow-up. So we are actually done on time. This is great. Thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. And I do hope that you got some sort of golden nugget. As long as you got one golden nugget from this webinar, we did our job. And reach out if you have any questions or needing some tools or resources. Jessie, can I include your email for the post or your email address?
Yes.
We'll include Jessie's contact information so you can connect with her directly. And I just want to say, I hope everyone has a happy, healthy holiday season. And we look forward to a great webinar lineup for 2019.